Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to tell you a few words about loop quantum gravity and observations. So basically, I'm going to focus not on singularities once again, but on a possible link with observations and experiments of a model which is free of singularity, so namely the loop quantum cosmology and the application of loop quantum gravity to black holes. So I apologize for losing 2 or 3 minutes. I would just like the talk to be self-contained. So I'm going to begin with the very basics of the theory, just because I remember when I was a beginner, and maybe all of us are not familiar with loop quantum gravity. So let's take 2 minutes to remind you what loop quantum gravity is, in a nutshell. So, you know, Carlo Rovelli is often saying that any good theory should be written on a t-shirt. We should be at least able to do so. So this is loop quantum gravity written on a t-shirt at a general public talk. So it looks quite easy, but of course, if you go into the details, everything is not that simple. So the basic idea is the following. If you take a canonical view, in loop quantum gravity, you begin with a figuration of space-time. So you have a 3 metric defined on hypersurfaces. And then you define the conjugate momentum, which is the Lie derivative with respect to the normal, and this defines the extrinsic curvature. You want those variables to be solutions of the Einstein's equation, so you implement constraints, diffeomorphism, Hamiltonian and Gauss constraints for the local triodes. And you could perform a quantization à la Dirac at this stage, but you would end up with the Wheeler-DeWitt theory, which is very nice, by the way, but which, as you know, is not very predictive, mostly because, of course, you need an inner product to define your Hilbert space, and the inner product of metrics is not very well defined. So you go to HTK variables, so the HTK connection and the densitized triodes. And as in any field theory, you need a kind of smearing of the variables to get rid of the delta function. And this is why you actually consider the holonomy of the HTK connection and the flux of the densitized triodes. And these are the basic variables that you quantize. You could alternatively take a covariant view. So you can think of something quite analogous to lattice quantum chromodynamics. So you have a graph, and you define the Hilbert space as a space of squared integrable functions over the ratio of the group to the L over the group to the N. So for QCD, this would be SU3. L is the number of links, and N is the number of nodes. And you define the Fock space by taking the appropriate limit. In the case of gravity, this is nearly the same, but instead of SU3, you have SU2, and then you factorize by the isomorphism group. And you defined neutral operator on this space, and because of gauge invariance and the Penrose theorem, you can have a kind of geometrical interpretation in the classical limit, and the so-called spin network basis is the one which diagonalizes the area and volume operators. So in a nutshell, this is the idea of the theory that I'm not at all going to discuss. Now I'm going to focus on phenomenology, that is it possible to test this framework? So let me begin by somehow nearly consensual results. That is the behavior of the background cosmological framework in loop quantum gravity. I begin with quite old results, and then I will switch to recent results. So we have to be fair. At this stage, loop quantum cosmology is not really the application of the full theory to the universe. We are quite far from this. This is mostly a kind of theory of the universe which borrows ideas from loop quantum gravity. So the point is that we have a dynamics which is very different from the old Wheeler, Misner, and DeWitt quantum metrodynamics, because in this framework, the singularity is resolved, which is not generically the case in quantum geometrodynamics. And the reason for that is that because the holonomy operator fails to be weakly continuous, we evade the von Neumann uniqueness theorem, and therefore already at the kinematical level, the dynamics is different from the Wheeler-Misner-DeWitt dynamics. So the Big Bang singularity seems to be resolved in a way which is reminiscent to what happens to the hydrogen atom in electrodynamics. There is no specific boundary condition which is required or imposed at what was the Big Bang in the classical theory. The quantum evolution remains deterministic through singularities in the sense that we can make prediction even by putting initial conditions in the previous cycle. So of course there is now a kind of other side of the singularity. The quantum states remain sharply peaked at least for a quite important number of cycles, and you can extract a kind of effective time from the arguments of the wave function. So the whole framework is not completely trivial, as Ashtekar reminded us, because you want the theory to have the correct infrared limit, so you want to recover the Friedman equation, but still you want to have quantum effects that are strong enough so that the singularity is cured when classical gravity is extremely intensely attractive. So this is a plot that Edward has also shown 2 days ago. So it's an old plot from Ashtekar. This is, if you want, time and volume of the universe. The red curves are the classical expanding and classical contracting Friedman solution, and the black and red dots are the results of LQC. So you see that if you begin today and if you go backward in time, you begin by following the classical expanding Friedman solution, but then instead of following it to the Big Bang, you basically bounce and you link it with the classical contracting Friedman expansion in a kind of quantum tunneling. And if you want to describe that effectively, you can rely on this modified Friedman equation that you have already seen several times. So this is the usual Friedman equation, and this is the additional term, which is a correction, of course, in the classical regime, but which turns out to be dominant around the bounds, just because this is positive, so now the density is bounded from above at the critical density. So this is the overall picture. So at this stage, I would say that the bounds seems to be quite robust. So there are still issues. Martin usually points out a lot of interesting issues, but there are quite good arguments also to believe that there is really a bounce in LQC. So basically, it has been shown for exactly solvable models, so flat isotropic with a massless scalar field, in the presence of spatial curvature, either positive or negative, for Bianchi models, with a negative and a positive cosmological constant, with a massive scalar field, for quite wide ranges of states corresponding to different classical universe, and also for quite a wide range of equations of state for barotropic matter. So there is no theorem, so there are still open issues that have to be considered seriously, but I would say that there are a lot of hints in favor of the bounds. Additionally, we have interesting results from other approaches that are strongly connected. So Daniele showed us a few days ago results from group field theory. So in this case, you basically try to describe cosmology as a kind of hydrodynamical limit of a Bose-Einstein condensate in the Gross-Pytayevsky approximation. And I find it very encouraging that they recover basically the same equation. Well, there should be a row here, so it's probably a row missing, but they basically recover the same equation with an additional term which is of probably low phenomenological consequence, so this is also a good confirmation. And unfortunately, Emanuele isn't speaking at this conference, but he would have shown nice results in quantum-reduced loop gravity, where they basically try to make the quantization before the symmetry reduction at a price, of course. This comes at a price, and the price to pay is a gauge fixing. And I also heard recently that there are new results from other people. So in this case, the Hamiltonian they recover is not exactly the same as in usual LQC. There is an additional term, but this does not replace the overall picture. We still have a bounce, but instead of having a contracting phase before the bounce, we might have an emergent phase. So this is very interesting. We are working out the associated phenomenology, but still the overall picture is not changed. And we also have interesting results, preliminary results, from spin foam cosmology. Okay, so let me now turn to what might be connected with observations and experiments. I want to emphasize this because this is the only thing I really believe in LQC. I mean, we have been all working on spectra, on perturbations, etc. That's extremely important. and we have to do that, and we continue doing this job. But honestly, my personal level of confidence is quite low, because there are a lot of hypotheses. What I believe is what I'm going to show now. So this is the square root of the potential energy density as a function of time. And basically, what you see here is deflation. What you see here is inflation. So for example, here you have, so this is a bounce, okay? This is a contracting phase, this is the expanding phase. Here you have no deflation. Deflation is the opposite of inflation, okay? Deflation is exponential contraction. Here you have no deflation and a big inflation. Here you have a big deflation and no inflation. Here you have a small deflation and a big inflation. Everything is possible. If you tune the initial conditions in LQC, you can have all those cases. All are possible. But the main point I want to emphasize is that they are not all equally probable. This is the interesting point. The only interesting point is that the probability for each scenario is not at all the same. And therefore, we basically know what happens. I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you the probability in details. This is a kind of phase space diagram. These are the square root of kinetic and potential energy density. So this circle here, well, it's not anymore a circle because of the projector, but it should be a circle. The red circle is the bounce, okay? This is the maximum energy density of your evolution of the universe. And this point here is both remote past and remote future, when the energy density is very small. So you begin here, the universe evolves, you go to the bounce, and then you go back to a low energy density. This plot is what does not happen. Actually, if you take random trajectories in the past, what happens is that your trajectories are very highly peaked at the bounce. So at the bounce time, you are not anywhere. You are exactly here or there, but it changes nothing to the phenomenology. So let me be more precise. This is the probability distribution function, the PDF, for the number of e-folds of inflation. So what happens in JR, in standard cosmology? In standard cosmology, how many e-folds of inflation do you have? Well, the result is we don't know. It completely depends on the fraction of potential and energy density when you put initial conditions. If you put initial conditions at the Planck density, you can have any number of e-folds between 0 and 10 to the 13. It is just bounded from above by the available energy. If you have an infinite energy, you have an infinite number of possible e-folds. But if you bound the energy from above as a Planck density, you have a number of e-folds which is between 0 and 10 to the 13. And it can be anything. You have no reason to have a preferred value. Between 0 and 10 to the 13. And here we have a preferred value, 140. And actually at 95% confidence level, it is between 120 and 160. So this is highly peaked around a value which happens to be quite interesting because it is higher than the 60 or 70 e-folds that are required to agree with observations. But still, it is not too high. And I will tell you later why I am happy that it is not too high. Sure.
Tell us how it fits with the Planck data.
It fits perfectly well with any observational data. The only thing that you need for observational data is to have at least 65 e-folds.
But you need this NS and R parameters, right?
Sure. We have inflation, so this is a completely standard model after the bounce. You have a scalar field, you have the bounce, you have inflation, so we recover exactly this slightly tilted power spectrum. But I will show you the spectra later. Right. So you will show the details.
You've made an assumption about the initial probability distribution.
Exactly. Sure.
To get to this.
Sure. I'm going to describe that into the details. That's the point. I mean, I want to make a statement. Maybe, you know, there are a lot of discussions about the measure problem in cosmology. There are, in some cases, measure problems in cosmology when you have infinite intervals. But in this case, there is no mystics or no magics between a kind of measure problem. The only question is there a variable to which I know how to assign a given PDF? If the answer is yes, you are happy. If the answer is no, you are not happy. So I can give the answer now. The variable to which we assign a known PDF is actually the phase of the scalar field in the remote past. Because here, of course, we have put a massive scalar field. I will show you later with other potentials. But the massive field is oscillating in its potential in the remote past. In the remote past, we are completely classical. We are far from the bound, so everything is under control. That's completely classical cosmology. And I mean, imagine you have a rotating device, and you take a picture, and you ask yourself, what is the angle of the device? Well, of course, the probability for the angle to be something is completely flat, okay? So we just put a flat PDF to the angle of the device as an initial condition. And of course, we check that this does not depend on the time at which we do that. If you do that at any time earlier, you end up with the very same result. But I'll show details. So recently, we went into a new paper where we generalized that. You know, in standard cosmology, we usually don't care about anisotropies because we know that they decay very fast. But in bouncing cosmology, you just cannot do that because in your Friedmann equation, the anisotropies are going like 1/8 to the 6. So the very reason why they get diluted very fast in usual cosmology is the reason why they increase very fast in a bouncing model. So the bounce is eventually shear dominated. So you just cannot ignore that. So you really have to make a Bianchi cosmology here. So we casted everything in this effective Friedmann equation with a quantum shear, but this is an old paper. And we also studied different potentials. So the massive scalar field that I have just described, a linear potential. This is a string theory-inspired potential because we are open-minded people. And this is Starobinsky potential, and as you know, Starobinsky potential is quite famous because both it was one of the first, maybe the first considered in inflation, and also it fits very well to Planck data. So in case you are not familiar with both those potential, this is what this one looks like and what this one looks like. And now we redid the same analysis with taking into account anisotropies and for wider potentials. And here are the results. So, of course, everything is numerical simulations because you have to solve coupled differential equations, etc. So, this is the PDF for the number of e-folds. So, this is what I showed before. Massive scalar field, initial conditions in the remote past, and no anisotropies. And this is basically the same information explained differently. Here, this is the number of e-folds as a function of the initial phase of the scalar field, right? So whatever the phase, you see that the number of e-folds is basically around 140, and this is what you find in the histogram. And from top to bottom, I am increasing the amount of shear. So I am increasing the initial anisotropy rate, and what is happening is that the number of e-folds is decreasing. So it was peaked here around 140, and now the mean value is smaller, and it is even bimodal, just because here the shear is energy dominated and the bounce is energy dominated, and here the bounce is shear dominated. This is the same study for the linear potential, so basically the same results. Instead of 140, it is split at 190. This doesn't make a lot of difference. And once again, when you increase the shear, the mean number of e-fold is decreasing as expected. But the trajectories can be quite complicated. This is for the string theory potential, so that's quite obvious. For one part of the potential, you recover the previous results, but as the potential is asymmetrical, you have also other trajectories which correspond to this peak here, and this is what happens for the Starobinsky potential. Only in this case, and I will explain why in 2 minutes, the value is not anymore around 150, it is around 10 to the 8. Maybe you cannot read. The peak value here is 10 to the 8, and I will explain in a minute why it is so different. So, now, let's take the very same model, okay, and see things differently. This is what basically Ashtekar and Aguyo and Nelson have been doing in the past. That is, let's put initial conditions at the bounds. So this is the very same physics, but you put a flat PDF to x. X is the square root of the fraction of potential energy at the bounds. And you ask you the very same question. The result is completely different. Forget about the dashed line, just take the plain line. Now, it is peaked around 10 to the 12 instead of 140. So it is completely different. So this is why I had a discussion with Eugenio a few days ago. I mean, the variable to which you put the PDF can completely change your result because they are completely non-linearly related. Okay? Sure.
I'm imagining that the mass of the scale field determines, at least in part, how many e-faults that you get. Are you assuming the mass is a gut scale or something?
No, I put it at 10 to the minus 6 plant mass as usually done, but of course it scales with the mass. You're completely correct.
And the larger it is, the smaller the number of e-faults?
Exactly.
So if you had at the gut scale, then it would be down by a factor of...
I can tell you the result. I even have the plot.
70, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. So you're declaring victory at 140, but possibly a little premature.
I mean, no. It is not a little. It is completely premature because, as I'm going to show you now, there are other parameters. Yeah.
That might be a little bit below what.
Exactly. I mean, not only the mass, but even the fact that it has a mass is questionable. I mean, the quadratic potential is somehow disfavored by data now. So not only the value of the mass can be questioned, but the very fact that it is a massive scalar field can also be questioned. So I completely agree with that. And this is precisely why we are also considering different potentials. So just to finish this point, you have completely different results here. Why? Just because I think that there is absolutely no reason to do that. Because here you put a flat potential to x, the fraction of potential energy, etc. But you have absolutely no motivation to do that. So those results were claimed in the past that generally in LQC we have a huge number of e-faults, but we don't have a huge number of e-faults. It's just here because you take an average value of x at 0.5, but because there is an attractor behavior, this is not what happens in real life.
Okay.
Yes?
As the uniform distribution in the face of the star field is important on this, can you say again how it's defined the face of the star field?
I mean, you know, in the contracting phase, at some point, the energy density of the universe is oscillating just because the scalar field is oscillating in the bottom of its potential. And here you have something which is completely harmonic. And you take a picture, an instantaneous picture, because you pick up a time and you wonder what is the phase. Well, I mean, it's just a rotating, or nearly rotating device. So the phase is anything between 0 and 2 pi. So the probability to find pi or pi over 2 or anything is just the same. That's just the assumption. And I think it cannot be wrong.
So just to translate it,
yeah.
Is it that the angle variable in the action angle variable is associated?
Exactly. So my point is that if the word initial is to be taken literally, then I think we should put initial conditions in the remote past and not at the bounds, as it has been done by other people recently. In addition, I mean, the bounce is the most quantum period in the history of the universe. So this is probably the worst time to put initial conditions. This is precisely where you would not like to do anything because this is the less controlled part of the evolution. And this PDF is, the PDF which shows is preserved over time. This is very important because, of course, if it was depending on the moment at which you put it, it would not be reliable. So what is the predictive power at the end of the day? I would say that there is a weak predictive power that I defined as the fact that you know the PDF. You know the probability distribution. I call that weak predictive power. And there is a strong predictive power, which is both I know the PDF and the PDF is highly peaked, which means basically that I know the value. Okay, if you roll a D, you know the PDF, but you don't know the answer. So this is what I call the weak predictive power. So the result of the analysis is that if we do that, in most of the cases, we have a quite strong predictive power in the sense that the number of e-faults is indeed predicted and peaked. This is not true, for example, in the Starobinsky potential. Here we only have weak predictive power. Why? Just because there is a plateau. And because of the plateau, the field can be thrown very, very, very far away on the plateau due to the evolution coming from the past and to the energy at which you arrive to the bounds. So the brute result is that if you have a confining potential, you don't care if it is phi to the 2 or phi to the 3 or even phi to the 4, even if it is excluded by data, you basically know the number of e-faults in this model. If you have a non-confining potential, a very flat potential, then you lose your predictive power. But the good news is that Planck data are now measuring the potential. We don't know exactly what it is, but for example, the quadratic potential is now excluded. So we have observational hints about what should be the potential. Then there is an important point I want to make, is that, you know, I mean, from a cosmological viewpoint, the problem of probing Planck scale physics is not that the Planck scale is too small, it is that the Planck scale is too big, actually. Because if you take an average amount of inflation, you know that the cosmological scales that were Planckian before inflation are today larger than the observable universe. They are way larger than the observable universe. So the problem, if you want to see the Planck scale in the CMB or in the sky, is not that the Planck scale is too small, that it is actually too big. And this is why, this comes as a surprise to some people, but this is why actually quantum gravity effects come in the infrared part of the spectrum, not in the ultraviolet. It comes in the infrared, because the Planck scales are larger than the Hubble size today. This is why people are, for example, considering non-Gaussianities. Because non-Gaussianities in the CMB are nonlinear effects. And because they are nonlinear, the modes do not decouple one from the other, and you can hope to see some trans-Planckian effect even within the Hubble sphere. But why I mention that now? Because I think that the fact that the number of e-faults that is predicted is not too high is good news. Because the higher the number of e-faults, the farther in the sky is the Planck scale at the bounds today. Okay, so I have to go on. Okay, so this is just something we published recently, which seems completely trivial to me, but I want to emphasize this. This is once again the PDF of the number of e-faults in LQC and in a toy model from JR. You just take contracting Friedman and you glue it with expanding Friedman at the Planck density. So this is completely an unphysical toy model. And basically the PDF are the same. I mean, a shift of 10 units, you don't care. They are the same. Yes, they are the same. There is no magic from LQC here. The fact that you have this prediction is not coming from LQC. It is just coming from the fact that you have a bounce. You just need a bounce, and you just need to fix the energy density at the bounce, and of course the details of the potential and mass, etc. If you want to be quantitative. So there is nothing strange here. Okay. So let me now comment on possible observations from pre-bounce events. For those of you who are not familiar with cosmology, for the real quantum gravity theorists, you know there is this notion in cosmology of luminosity distance. For example, if you are in the expanding universe and the supernova is exploding, and you look at the supernova, and you wonder what is the distance at which I should consider the supernova to be to compute the observed flux. I mean, do you take the distance when it exploded or the distance today? Because in the meanwhile, the universe has expanded. Well, of course, it is in between, and the result is the so-called luminosity distance. This is the distance at which, in a static space, you should put the object so that it is diluted as it is in the expanding universe. And now you can ask yourself, what about the luminosity distance? Not in the expanding universe, but in the contracting universe, if we have a bounce. And then that's quite interesting. This is the luminosity distance between an event in the past and an observer which is sitting before the bounce. So this is fully in the contracting phase of the universe. And this is for different equation of state of the content of the universe. And the lowest one is not exotic, this is just a matter-dominated universe, dust. So it's not at all something crazy. And what you see here is that the luminosity distance is actually decreasing with time. So it means, which is completely counterintuitive, that if a supernova exploded longer ago in the past, you see it brighter. Just because the contraction of the universe overcompensates for the dilution of the wave. So this raises very interesting issues. For example, there are consistency issues. You cannot have, for example, a universe contracting forever and filled with stars, because the energy density would blow up at any point. Anyway, this is a kind of reversed Olber's paradox. But even if you forget about the paradoxes, then it's very interesting because you might observe pre-big bounce events. So of course you need something that goes through the bounce without being destroyed. And I assume that the only possibility is gravitational waves, just because they are weakly coupled. It's not even obvious, not at all, that they would survive the bounce, but they could survive the bounce. And usually what is thought, of course, is that anyway we don't care because they are so diluted that they can't be seen. This might not be true because they could be amplified by what happened in the contracting phase, and it could even be possible with detectors like LIGO to detect pre-bounce events. The only problem, but it's a big problem, is that for this hypothesis to work, you need a huge amplification, because after that you have a huge dilution. And to have a huge amplification, you are not anymore in the perturbative regime at the bounds. So to me, this doesn't mean that this is wrong. This just means that I don't know how to calculate it, because everything here is perturbative, and if the amplification seems to be enough so that we see something after, it's not at all perturbative at the bounds. So this is an open issue. But still, I think the possibility is interesting. We have recently published that. Okay, let me now come to the perturbation, the spectra, and all the dirty stuff. There are different schools of thoughts, and no consensual result. It's a complicated problem. It's really a complicated problem. So I just tell you a few words about the different possibilities. One is a dressed metric, pushed forward by Ashtekar, Raguyo, Nelson, and relying on nice results from Jurek Lewandowski. They really try to deal with quantum fields on a quantum background, so this is a very appealing approach. The weakness is that the consistency of this theory is not established. It is not clear that it is anomaly-free. So as for any proposal, there are pros and cons. Basically, they end up with a spectrum which looks like the one of JR, because their propagation equation after 50 pages of calculation is basically the one of JR. And just to show you what happens, these plots are from Ashtekar. This is a length scale, and yes, and this is the curvature radius of the universe. This is in JR. So here, if you go backward in time, they never cross each other, and this is why you can choose the so-called Bunch-Davies vacuum. You know, if you go far in the past, the modes do not feel curvature, so they are as in Minkowski vacuum. And here, this is what happens in LQC. The physical scale crosses the curvature radius of the universe, so the modes begin to feel curvature. They are not anymore in the Bunch-Davies vacuum, and therefore you might have interesting observational effects. The second approach that has been developed is the so-called deformed algebra, which follows initial ideas by Martin Boyewald, even though I think he doesn't like this name, but we don't care about the name. So the idea of deformed algebra is to really make sure that the theory is consistent in the sense that the vectors of evolutions are parallel to the submanifolds of constraints, and that the theory is, by construction, anomaly-free. So in my opinion, maybe there is not much less of LQG in this framework, but at least this is a consistent framework. So you recover the usual algebra of JR with just an additional term here. This omega term is the only correction coming from LQG. And this omega term is something which is +1 in the classical limit. So to date is +1. But it goes to -1 at the bounds. So when the density approaches Planck density or critical density, then omega is -1. And omega is changing sign as half the Planck density, or I mean Planck or critical bounds density, if you want, at half the Planck density. So we have this phase with omega negative, which could be interpreted as a change of signature. So it might be that space-time is actually space. It is purely Euclidean around the bounds, and it is Lorentzian in the low-energy regime, with a kind here of appearance of time or phase transition. You can also interpret this surface as a surface of asymptotic silence, in the sense that all the space points are decoupling one from the other. And there are very interesting ideas about quantic initial conditions here, like Martin and Jakub have considered related with the so-called trichomy problem in mathematics. We followed another path, which is to consider that this is not really a change of signature, but just an effective effect that appears as a kind of tachyonic instability for the propagation of modes. So this is just to impress you and show that the calculations are quite hard. But at the end of the day, you can make your perturbation theory. You can recast everything in Mukhanov-Sasaki variables that are gauge invariant, and you can compute spectra. The spectra are not very nice looking. They are quite different from the scale invariant spectrum that accounts for the data. It is compatible with data here, not at all in the infrared and not at all in the ultraviolet. There are very good reasons for that, and I am not at all ashamed to show you this, because, I mean, you know, there has been a quite of belief in the cosmology community that as soon as you have a theory which has JR as its infrared limit and which predicts inflation, anyway it will account for data. And that's wrong. I mean, we have the infrared limit which is correct, we have inflation, and still we are in disagreement with data. So some not LQC as a whole, let me be clear, just this very specific framework. But that's good, because it means that quantum gravity is really entering the field of experimental physics, and you can now exclude some settings. So these are, to sum up, the spectra coming from the dressed metric approach. It is completely scale invariant here up to infinity in the UV, and this is basically where you expect the observational window to be. And this is a spectrum coming from one version of the deformed algebra approach, with this exponential rise, which is obviously unphysical and in disagreement with data. But the interesting point also is that part of the spectra are nearly the same. So there is a kind of consensus of what is happening here. And the reason is not magic. It's just because what happens here is driven not by the details of the way perturbation evolves, but just by the background structure. And we share the same background. So the background structure accounts for this, and the details of the gravitational waves, because this is tensor spectra, propagation accounts for the ultraviolet. Okay. In my opinion, there is a very important point that has been too much disregarded, which is the Trans-Planckian effect. I mean, Planckian density effects are accounted for. This is a bound. When the density becomes Planckian, we have a bound and we are happy, etc. But we have not cared, I think, enough about Planck length effect. If you have an average amount of inflation, for example, 140, my preferred value, and you run the universe backward in time, the size of the universe, of the observable universe today, was Trans-Planckian at the bounds by a factor 10 to the 30. It is 10 to the 30 times smaller than the Planck length. And we have a theory which basically tells us there is nothing smaller than the Planck length. And we propagate those modes as if nothing special was happening. This is not physical. In the dressed metric approach, this is somehow taken into account, but only somehow. It works if modes are slightly Trans-Planckian, but surely not for highly Trans-Planckian modes. So at this stage, I don't know what to do. I mean, it's completely unclear how to handle that. This is a complicated problem. So we just took, this is another recently published paper with Kilian Martineau. We just follow a poor man's approach that is implementing modified dispersion relations as usually done, for example, in black hole physics when people are testing how the Hawking evaporation are robust with respect to Trans-Planckian phenomena. So here we took the so-called Unruh relation. Yeah?
Well, I'm sorry, maybe you're going too fast for me, but you're calling a power spectrum, this is a predicted power spectrum of gravitational waves.
Yeah, this was a tensor spectrum.
Yes. Would you want to compare, for example, to the cosmic microwave background?
Yeah, I mean...
at the moment, the power spectrum on small scales is completely overwhelmed by lensing. So when you say it's ruled out or not preferred, it's not actually ruled out at all at the moment, yes?
No, I mean, I completely agree with you. We have not yet detected primordial B modes at all, so we don't know.
Even on small scales where we have detected stuff that's from gravitational lensing and not from primordial modes.
Yes,
so you're safe, even in your... But yes, you see there are models which are not preferred. They're still allowed by the data.
Not really, because you know from Planck data we have upper limits on the ratio, the scalar to tensor ratio.
On large scales, yes. On the very large scales, not on the small scales.
But it depends what you call large and small, because actually no, because on this plot here, if you know this is co-mobile wave number. At some time, at some point,
peak in the power spectrum?
Yeah, that's the point. The observational window is actually here. What Planck is seeing is there. It depends on the number of efforts of inflation, but for an average number, it's there. That's the point.
So these are much larger scales than that.
Exactly. This is what I was saying at the beginning. The interesting feature is happening on scales that are larger than the Hubble radius. That's unfortunate, but that's the case. So this is the Unruh modified dispersion relation. This is energy as a function of k. Okay. So here, when k, the wave number, reaches the Planck value, the energy is saturating. And this is just to show you the spectra. This is the equivalent of this spectrum, but with this modified dispersion relation, following Brandenberger and Martin works. And now the spectrum is again scale invariant. You don't care about small oscillations. Small oscillations are anyway washed out by cosmological evolution. So from the observational viewpoint, this is a straight line. So now it works. So the approach that was not working is now working if you implement this dispersion relation. Just to show you, this is another dispersion relation, quite a lot discussed in the literature, when the energy now vanishes for trans-Planckian modes. It's a way to account for the fact that there is nothing trans-Planckian. And now I switch to the dress metric spectrum, the one which was working. Now it's not working anymore. So my point here is that we have to be very careful. There was a kind of Starobinsky nearly theorem that we don't care about trans-Planckian physics, and the arguments are correct in the standard Big Bang theory. This is not correct in a bouncing model, so we have to be very careful about what happens to smooth scales. Okay, let me now switch, I'm too slow, to the second part of my talk, that is black holes. I'm done with cosmology. So recently with Karim Louis and Alejandro Perez, we went through a simulation of the evaporation of black holes in loop quantum gravity by basically studying taking into account the area eigenvalues of the black hole and making a Monte Carlo simulation with the accurate gravity factors obtained by solving the Klein-Gordon equation in the vicinity of the black hole, etc., etc. And at the end of the day, there are tons of plots in the paper, but the results are the following. We are sensitive to the Barbero-Imierzi parameter, which is the key parameter of loop quantum gravity. This plot, for example, is the end life of an evaporating black hole for different values of gamma. And we are sensitive to the model in the sense that, for example, if you account for the entropy of black holes by purely gravitational degrees of freedom, or if you take into account in holographic models the degeneracy coming from quantum field theory with a cutoff in the horizon, you don't have the same evaporating spectra. So that's encouraging. I mean, I was happy of the result. We also made a Kolmogorov-Smirnov spectrum to evaluate how many black holes we would need to discriminate between models. But still, we have never seen an evaporating black hole, right? And to be honest, I don't expect to see one in my lifetime. So this is theoretically interesting, but I would not call that a link with observation. So recently, in a recent PRL paper, I have studied another idea. You know, this is the possible areas of black holes in loop quantum gravity if you define a black hole as the intersection of an isolated horizon with a spin network, and you have punctures defined when the spin network intersects the horizon. J is a quantum number. Sorry, J is a quantum number associated with the intersection, which is a whole integer. There is a wide view in the community that as soon as a black hole is large, much larger than the Planck size, you recover a completely continuous spectrum just because the density of state is exponentially rising. And this is true. The exponentially of U states is indeed exponentially rising when the black hole becomes big, and therefore you end up with a standard Hawking spectrum. This is correct if you take this view, but I suggested recently to take another view, which is really to consider that the Hawking spectrum is somehow triggered by quantum gravity, and that the evaporation spectrum comes from the change of quantum state of an elementary area sail. So it's not anymore a global process, it's a local quantum gravity view on black holes. If you do that, that's quite interesting, because you end up with something which looks like the so-called, maybe you remember, it was popular maybe 15 years ago or something like that, the so-called Mukhanov-Bekenstein hypothesis. They made the hypothesis that during the evaporation, the area of the black hole can only change by Planck steps in area. And this was very interesting for the following reason. If this is true, then you have line in the spectrum at any mass, even arbitrarily far away from the Planck scale. You take a solar mass, because a solar mass black hole nearly does not evaporate at all. But you take a 10 to the 15 grams black hole, so it's 10 to the 20 Planck mass, you still have the lines with exactly the same relative separation that at the Planck scale. So you have quantum gravity effect even arbitrarily far away from the Planck scale. And the reason for that is completely trivial. And this is what happens here. With this model, it's slightly more complicated, but as a limit, it recovers the Mukhanov-Bekenstein hypothesis. So I showed that you can distinguish also between different LQG models, because some are favoring high spins, others are favoring low spins, and this slightly distorts the spectrum. An important point. I mean, you have lines instead of a continuum. The lines are at precise energies for a given mass. But when the black hole evaporates, its mass is decreasing, right? And therefore the position of the line is shifting inevitably. So you might be afraid of recovering a continuous spectrum just because of this evolution effect. And I checked that this is not the case. You really can see the lines even when taking into account the dynamics. It's not washed out by the initial mass spectrum of black hole as long as the temperature of the universe has not varied by more than a factor of 2. This is the hypothesis. And the most important point is that it is not also hidden by the secondary component. I mean the following. When the black hole evaporates, it emits gamma rays. You know the distribution of gamma rays. But it also emits quarks that are fragmentating into pions, not only, but partially into pions, and neutral pions are decaying into gamma rays. But those gamma rays do not have the same energy, of course, as the initial gamma rays. They have a wide spectrum, even though the first one have peaked values. The gamma rays coming from hadronization have a wide spectrum. And you might be afraid that the wide spectrum is hiding the peaked spectrum. And again, by making a Monte Carlo simulation, this is not the case. You can really see the process. So this, to me, it is not observational, because I would still need to see an evaporating black hole that I don't see, but it is better than this in the sense that I don't need the black hole to be Planckian. Okay, let me now switch to bouncing black hole, and I'm going to focus on what Francesca didn't have time to mention in her talk to be complementary. So this does not look like this at all, but I like this general public picture. So the idea is basically the following. I am running out of time, so let me make it short. You have a collapsing null shell. This is Minkowski, this is Schwarzschild, and this is the quantum region. And the collapsing null shell is then bouncing to an evading null shell. And the hypothesis of this model is that the time required for the bounce to take place was of the order of m squared, with a numerical factor k that I'm going to study later. So m squared is interesting just because this is smaller than m cubed, and m cubed is the Hawking time. So in this model, the dynamics of black holes would be really driven by the bounce, and the Hawking evaporation would just be seen as a kind of dissipative correction to the bounce. So I'm just going to focus on the phenomenology of that. Wow. So this is just a slide to say that in principle, in LQG, we should be able to calculate that. We only need a background free theory of quantum gravity because this is a non-perturbative process. So this is a very good toy model for loop quantum gravity. At least it is fair to say that the m-squared behavior is not recovered in loop quantum gravity, but still this is a very good benchmark, I think, for the theory to prove that it is able to make predictions. Or not, but I hope yes. So here are the results. If you want the bouncing time to be equal to the Hubble time, so that primordial black holes possibly formed just after the Big Bang or the Big Bounce are bouncing today, this fixes their initial mass at 10 to the 23 kilograms. No, this is 10 to the 15 for the Hawking evaporation. So, as expected, 10 to the 15 grams. So, as expected, this is bigger than the mass associated with the Hawking time. And you wonder what happens when such a black hole does bounce. So, there are two naive possibilities. One is that basically you emit radiation with a wavelength which is of the order of the size of the hole. This is the only scale of the problem, so this is what you naively expect. And this gives rise to what we call the low energy signal, which is driven by the size. The low energy signal is in the infrared range. And the other possibility is to say, well, how are these black holes formed? They are assumed to be formed because of the collapse of a null shell in the early universe. But then we know what went in, and the process is completely symmetrical. The amount of red shift is compensating for the amount of blue shift, and therefore what goes out is exactly what went in. And we know the temperature of the universe where they were formed. Or, I mean, we can guess, we can bet on the temperature of the universe. And in this case, we have a high energy component, which is in the TeV range. So what to do with that? So first, with Francesca and other friends, we have evaluated at which size at which distance, in the universe, we can see a bouncing black hole. And this depends on this three parameter k that I mentioned before. If k is of order 1, which is probably the best view, then you can see a bouncing black hole anywhere in the universe. So that's interesting. If k is higher, then you need the black hole to be, for example, within the galactic structure. And the crazy stuff here are very easy to understand. Here, This is just because you have larger detectors in the optical band than in the ultraviolet, for example, so you are more sensitive, so you can see far away. And this step here is due to the fact that you begin to emit new particles that are decaying into gamma rays, so your number of gamma rays is increasing, and you have small steps downside because you emit new particles that are not decaying into gamma rays and they borrow energy. So there is quite a lot of naive physics going into this plot. You can do the same for the high energy component by stimulating the hadronization, etc. And the result is that you see slightly less far, but still, if K is not too large, you can see the black hole anywhere up to the galactic scale, which is already very good. Then we wonder that maybe instead of a single bouncing black hole, it could be smart to look for continuous signal coming from the accumulation of quite a lot of bouncing black holes. So this is a diffuse emission, so we calculated this. We showed that this is not highly sensitive to the initial mass spectrum of primordial black holes. This is important because we don't know what is the initial spectrum of primordial black holes. I mean, we don't even know if primordial black holes do exist. But if they exist, we don't know what their spectrum is looking like. So we checked that the results are not sensitive to that. And this is the kind of spectra we obtained. So there are different shapes because there are free parameters in the model. But still, there is a kind of characteristic feature of a distorted Gaussian, and this is due to a redshift distance accumulative effect that are quite characteristic, and to my knowledge, there are no other astrophysical phenomena that look like this. You might have heard that there is a gamma ray satellite, Fermi, which is an excess of gamma rays coming from the galactic center. Most probably, this is due to astrophysical processes that have been missed, most probably, but still there is some room for new physics. You cannot explain it with purely classical, usual astrophysics. So we try to understand whether bouncing black holes could account for this excess, and these are the results. So the red points are the data. This red line is the astrophysical background, and the blue line is the model. I mean, let's be fair, they are free parameters, so there is no magic here. We tune the parameters so that it works. So the fact that it can work, well, the fact that it can work is not fantastic, but it is not trivial. For example, you cannot for sure explain this with the Hawking phenomenon. With evaporating black hole, it's completely impossible to explain that. So it's not trivial that you can explain that, but it's not a smoking gun. But the interesting point is that the background component of this population is not above the background. So to me, this was the interesting part of the study. I am not far from having finished. As Francesca mentioned it, there is an interesting effect, which is the fact that the redshift dependence of bouncing black hole is not the same as the redshift dependence of any other signal, either decaying dark matter or astrophysics. If you take decaying dark matter or pulsars or anything, if you look at a galaxy at redshift z, you will see the signal at an energy E divided by 1 plus z, by definition of the redshift, right? But this is not the case for bouncing black hole, because if you look far away, it means that the black hole have bounced in the past, and therefore they had a smaller lifetime, and therefore their mass was smaller, and therefore the emitted energy was higher. And this compensates for the redshift. And this is why bouncing black hole have this flat curve, whereas any other phenomena have this blue curve. So this is also an interesting, I think, observational possibility. A few weeks ago, we published also a paper on the stochasticity of the process. Up to now, except in one work by Francesca, the process was considered as deterministic. This is obviously wrong. This is a tunneling process, so it is probabilistic in nature. And if you take into account its probabilistic nature, then you can shift the energy of the resulting signal, and in particular, the idea that Carlo and Francesca had that maybe this could account for fast radio burst now becomes completely reasonable. You can really have the required energy. And even if the mass spectrum is wide, there is a clear experimental prediction for the shape of the spectrum. So I think I am done. So let me summarize. I would say that at this stage, there is no clear experimental prediction. I mean, there are clear experimental predictions at the Planck scale, but we don't care because we don't see the Planck scale. So for cosmology and black holes, there is no smoking gun that loop quantum gravity tells you expect this. I don't think there is such a prediction at this stage. There is not even a clear tendency. For example, I would love to say that the scalar to tensor ratio is higher or smaller than in JR, that the spectrum is bluer or redder than in JR. Even that, it's not the case at this stage. Still, a lot of progresses are being made, and I bet that in a couple of years, for the third conference on singularity resolution, we would be able to give this tendency. We have to keep trying. I just mentioned 2 lines of research that I have not worked on up to now, but that I like very much. First one is quasi-normal modes. We are just beginning to calculate that for black holes with loop quantum gravity corrections. As this is related with gravitational waves, I think this is something that should be done. And also there is all this Lorentz invariance violation stuff, which is interesting. You know, there are no convincing results at this stage, even though Giovanni, I mean, no, Camelia has some ideas, but it is worth surely going further in this direction. Okay. And just as a conclusion of the conclusion, I mean, let us not be afraid. I'm tired to see any community of physicists discarding the ideas of the other as too exotic. So I am not afraid of the multiverse, of white holes, of extra dimensions. I mean, we just have to study what we are believing in. Thank you.
First, I have a remark. So it's not true that the relativity equation does not solve the singularity problem. There are many examples in which they solve the singularity problem. Using a canonical scalar field, with the von der Waals interpretation I showed yesterday, that you have a bouncing trajectory exactly like loop quantum cosmology from when to have. Also, if you have interdynamical fluid, you can have also bouncing trajectories, even in probabilistic interpretation. So it's not, this is not true. Okay. Now my question is a question that I think should be posed by everyone that works on quantum cosmology. What is the interpretation of quantum mechanics that is behind your quantum cosmology?
No. Okay, so first, okay, I completely agree with you. I mean, Ashtekar claimed was just that it is not completely generically resolved, but it can be resolved for sure. I mean, let me be 100% honest. What I'm doing is not quantum at all. Actually, what is done here, all the phenomenology, it's not completely true for everyone. Some people are doing other things, but all that I have presented here is just relying on a completely classical theory where you have modifications coming from loop quantum gravity ideas. For example, in the cosmological sector, I mean, it is as simple as, I mean, the calculations are complicated, but the idea is very simple. You just replace some parameter in the Hamiltonian by an harmonic function of this parameter. You have good reason for that. It's not popping out of the blue, but still, this is, at the end of the day, this is a completely classical approach. I mean, of course, when you compute perturbations, you have to be quantum at some point to normalize your perturbations. But we are still quite far from, I think, asking ourselves the question you are mentioning now. It should be done, but probably maybe in group field theory or in other approaches, they are dealing with that. But at this stage, I mean, to me, this is premature to answer that.
But if I can,
sure.
Just a small comment on this. People have been, well, of course, because we have one person in our community who has his own interpretation of quantum mechanics. This is spreading also in the community. I mean, I refer to the relational quantum mechanics approach. But people have been doing, trying different approaches, different interpretations of quantum mechanics within loop quantum cosmology. I think, for instance, Param Singh using consistent histories and so on. So, I mean, it's like with quantum mechanics. You can take different interpretations, and what is nice is that different interpretations allow you to try different strategies within your theory. But the theory itself doesn't have any interpretation.
Okay, so let's thank our speaker again.